be talking a little bit about sustainable aviation, from ambition to action, with a particular focus on sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. And I am conscious that CEPSA and Apical recently struck a deal just back in April in Spain to spend about $1 billion developing a plant that will eventually, I hope I'm correct, produce about 800 tonnes by 2026 of either SAF or renewable diesel, which is about 25 million gallons. Now, at the moment, the world's aviation industry is currently using about 100 billion gallons a year. So that's just a drop in the bucket for what we actually need to power something like 25,000 planes in the world's commercial fleet. So, Carla, perhaps if I could direct the first question at you. Supply, or lack of it, is this the major challenge in SAF as you see it?
Well, thank you, Katrina. I think that we definitely need to scale up the sustainable aviation fuel. Unlike other hard-to-abate industries, the pathway, the technological pathway for decarbonizing aviation is pretty clear, both in the short, medium, and even long term. So I think that the big challenge that we have ahead of us is how do we scale up an industry that is by nature global, but currently is organized either country or maximally regionally. One of the key issues in this business, and as we think on scaling up, is we still have a patchwork of regulations, mandates across the world that make it very difficult for investors to understand and predict demand, and for airlines to have a very clear framework within which operate.
Pradeep, one of the other issues with the sustainable aviation fuel, of course, is what goes into making it. And Apical is, the world's biggest producer of palm oil and feedstock. What sort of other things can we use to make sustainable aviation fuel, and where does feedstock come in?
Just a little bit of a correction on the volumes earlier. It's 800,000, a couple of zeros missing at the back. And it's actually a million tons of production. So currently what you have is what you call a HEFA technology, which uses liquid-based waste and residue to convert to basically sustainable aviation fuel. But I think there is more technologies that are being tested at the moment to look at solid-based waste and residue to be converted. So if you look at the global requirement for jet fuel by 2030, I think it's roughly about 500 million metric tons. And even if you take a 5% mandate for SAF, you're looking at 25 million tons. And then if you add the road transportation, the fuel, the sustainable fuel, or rather renewable fuel that's required for the road transportation as well, you're looking at something like 50 million tons. And today, you do not even have 5 million tons available as far as capacity is concerned. So the capacity will come into play. And as far as we are concerned, I think, looking at the supply and demand, the HEFA technology is possible to convert roughly about what the world requires until 2030. But the challenge is what's there 2030 onwards. And that's where the new technologies have to come into play.
So what needs to be driving this? Because, ultimately it's the airlines that are on the front line of this, but they're not making the planes and they're also not making the fuel. So is it governments that need to lead this push? Perhaps, Munal, you'd like to jump in?
Yeah. So I think, when it comes to sustainable aviation fuel, it's a team sport. It requires many different players in the ecosystem to come together. SAF itself is quite beautiful in the way that it's a drop-in fuel, right? So your last mile logistics doesn't need an upgrade. All of that can exist as it does. But getting from feedstock to production and getting the chicken and egg situation around, supply and demand addressed is really, what is at the core of the problem in terms of scaling it. And I think governments across the world are taking different approaches. You know, we can clearly see some very strong action, say from Scandinavia, which has, you know, set up targets of like 30%. You see rest of Europe and many other countries coming in, you know, at 6% or 10% by 2030. In Asia, there are a few countries which are contemplating. Japan is expected to announce some measures soon. India is also contemplating a 2030 target. There are airlines, of course, who have also, you know, done the same. So lots of activity happening there. There are also, you know, there's another approach that governments have taken, which is to make SAF more affordable. And that is the route that US has gone. So while the airlines there have made their commitments, what the government has done is like riding on, you know, their roads mandate and what they've been doing for renewable diesel anyways, tried to make US an attractive location for, you know, picking up SAF. So right now in the US, you can get SAF at almost, you know, 1.5x the price of, or 1.2x the price of jet fuel, which is, you know, a big differentiator. Other places, it probably is like 3.5 to 4 times, right? So the reason why this is a challenge is because SAF is expensive and somebody's got to pay. So US creates some disproportionate advantages for setting up, you know, base there. And then the other way the governments can help is by creating a strong demand signal, right? And I think many countries are in that journey of figuring out how much, how soon, how fast, what should be the pace of implementation.
Let's perhaps talk about infrastructure for a little bit and Singapore's role in that, because, you know, it's one thing to be making SAF in Spain or you know, in Singapore we have a production base as well, but, you know, you've got to get it to where it's needed, where the planes need to refuel. And if you're a carrier flying domestic routes in Indonesia, it's not much help if it's here in Singapore. You know, who'd like to jump in and address that, because that's a big issue.
Well, I think that from a European perspective and talking from Spain as an operator who's been supplying airlines for the last 40 years, what I have to say is, first, it makes a big difference if you're an incumbent who has been supplying airlines for, you know, for decades, because it's not only a question of infrastructure, it's also a question of capability. You need to have, you know, the safety standards and security to supply, you know, airplanes day in and day out, and that's not easy to build in a you know, market that is really constrained. You need to have specialized people. So it's not only the hardware, the infrastructure, it's also the software, it's the people and the skills that we need to build. So incumbent players have definitely an advantage. In Spain, we have, on top of that, one of the most efficient fuel distribution systems, fully integrated pipeline north to south and east to west, that allow us to, again, through mass balance, supply airlines wherever they are, regardless the locations they come from. And again, I recognize that might be a little bit of an unfair advantage relative to other countries, but we are confident that in Spain we have a really efficient system that as soon as we get the green molecules into it, will provide airlines with a very cost-efficient system. And then, just a couple of months ago, and together with our partners from Apical, we did a launch in Seville. It's a busy airport, not one of the main airports in Spain, but we partnered with 6 of the top airlines in Spain and with infrastructure operator. And that tells you the challenges that, you know, we're going to have to overcome as we transition to green molecules. It was really difficult to get, you know, a simple, track with the molecules and deliver it to airplanes. It was the whole logistic that had to be put in place. So definitely, when we talk about cost, to me the cost of SAF is only, of manufacturing SAF, is only a fraction of all the costs that we need to look at. And then, as you said, the distribution, the last mile, is an important consideration.
Mm-hmm. But in terms of, you know, Singapore, we were talking earlier, and Singapore's place in that sort of chain, we're at an advantage here, really.
Yeah. So, yes, Singapore definitely. So being an international hub for both business as well as aviation, Singapore has to have that mandate in place sooner. I think they're hopefully they're going to come up with something very soon, because it's something to A bit with the reputation factor as well, because I mean you are a leading ASEAN hub, so hence you have to be the leader as well. And we are already seeing Japan in play, and a country like Thailand is probably is on its way to announce as well. So it's going to put a bit of pressure on Singapore, because for whatever it is, as far as ASEAN is concerned, Singapore is the leader when it comes to logistics, and especially both the sea and the airports are concerned. So hence they will do something. But leaving that aside, even if you look at palm oil, the supply, I mean, which is almost 45% or 50% of the global edible oil supplies, and that in itself has the waste and residue possibilities. And if you look at Singapore as a location, strategic location, you are now covered with Malaysia and Indonesia, the world's largest producers of palm oil, and hence you have a natural advantage, right? That's one. So hence, I think you have the possibility of therefore going ahead and putting a very strong mandate in place, and hence leading the ASEAN concept. And then, of course, it's good to sort of carry ASEAN with you as well, because, logistically and like what Carlos covered, if we look at Indonesia, the domestic travel is huge. Malaysia, maybe not very big, but Singapore, definitely not. But, it's important to have an ASEAN mandate that will cover pretty much all of the countries, and hence, then the supply, demand, the logistical advantages then come into play, and it will be, who has the demand.
Let me just build on that, because one of the things that European Union has done in the last few months is reviewing a book and claim or a mass balance solution to address some of these challenges. So having a regional consistent framework allows to optimize the supply of that, so airlines can decarbonize while using the optimal locations and without moving the product around. Again, this is something that European Union will confirm next year, but I really think that having a coherent policy in a region will definitely help optimize the logistics and the last mile delivery.
And sorry, just Singapore is looking at opportunities to pretty much get into the greener part of things, right? And very much in respect to renewables. You don't have the hydro possibilities. You don't have sufficient amount of land to build on solar, and you also don't have sufficient land and wind possibilities. What's left, right? And you got to lead somewhere. So this is probably the best opportunity. And the second one is marine as well, right? I mean, you are, as far as ASEAN and maybe after China, Asia is concerned, you have the greatest opportunity for both aviation as well as marine. And this is a super opportunity that Singapore must take it on and lead.
One of the things, Munal, that you mentioned, of course, was cost, and the cost of SAF. It's, currently it's a factor more than jet fuel is currently. And, I think one thing that everyone is especially interested in is who's going to pay for this. And I was reading a report the other day from ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, that said, ultimately people could be looking at, perhaps $70, $75 a ticket on long-haul flights from, Singapore to Dubai, for example, or New York to Paris. And I think we've got a slide here just showing a pie chart showing the breakup of where, the most this is needed, and particularly it's that long-haul, mid-haul flight segment. So, in your view, what will this do to the cost of already high airfares, let's face it, after COVID? And will passengers be willing to foot that bill?
Very, very good question. So, if you just look at the base principle of it, the user should pay for it, right? So the passengers should be paying for the carbon emissions that they are creating. But of course, it doesn't get as simple as that. So airlines have to, think about their revenue management and pricing strategy and their competitive positioning in the market to figure out, how comfortable they are to pass on what share of the premium to the passengers and where they want to, take a hit on their own P&L. So I think that's a question that many airlines are thinking about as well. We've done, many studies in general to think about sustainability preferences. And I think customers are clearly more aware about the need for sustainability and making the green choices. But are they paying for it? I think there is still, some distance to cover. And I think that is what, creates or gives the airlines a little bit of jitters. But then, again, different airlines are approaching it in different ways. So, for example, we see Air France and KLM actually passing it down to the consumer. So, if you think of a small blend, the number is actually much smaller than, say, $75 per ticket. It can be, really small. And then you can load it differently on economy versus business, right, to minimize the impact. And they are passing it on. Others like Lufthansa, which has their Compensate platform, I don't think there are public numbers yet, but based on initial discussions, I think even they are finding it difficult that they're not finding that a lot of people are voluntarily stepping up, and making the green choices. Maybe a small portion of the market is, but it's not fully there yet. And hence, I think there is a important role for government and airlines to think about how they want to give that demand signal and how they want to pass on the costs to the users or the passengers. And if there are support mechanisms required, who pays for it? Is it the taxpayers or is it just the passengers? Those are really the trade-offs.
Let me just add a couple of things to Munal's point. First, maybe something that we all realized after COVID, right? That is, the most expensive flight is the one that you're not going to have, right? Because it's replaced by either a virtual Teams meeting or simply not taking those holidays because of your carbon footprint. We are starting to see that significant push in Europe, where Europe is recommending to use trains rather than short, long flights. And that's, to me, for the aviation industry, a wake-up call that the next 10 years are going to be critical to make this industry sustainable, or a significant part of it will be replaced by alternative modes of transport that are more sustainable. Second, we always look at the price of a ticket, but in terms of society and for policy makers, we need to look at the total cost of decarbonization. And as Munal said at the beginning, sustainable aviation fuels are drop-in fuels that use exactly the same infrastructure. We don't need to change engines, we don't need to change aircraft, we don't need to change the logistic infrastructure. So in terms of societal cost, that's the biggest ticket. I really think sustainable aviation fuel is a ready now solution that I think is cost effective and help us to decarbonize immediately. And then finally on consumers, I definitely agree that no one will voluntarily say, I want a more expensive ticket, although I probably pay between 20 and 30% more for my flight to Singapore this time than 3 years ago, right? And no one is complaining. Everyone is crazy. Airports are full. So there is something that is changing in terms of the perception. But we have, in CEPSA, we are seeing it, and that's the reason why we are accelerating our plans to build this new plant. We are starting to see, private companies, corporates that are willing to pay a premium today, for these flights to be decarbonized. So again, early days, early adopters, but definitely a very clear trend and direction of travel.
But where's your price point? Are you willing to pay $100 more for a long-haul flight? Or $1,000? Where do you draw the line?
So maybe a question here, right? So how many
maybe
of
a show
you,
of hands.
Yeah, so how many of you, if you are traveling economy, say $7 extra from here to London, how many of you are willing to pay that? $7. Yeah, fantastic. I did this in the office and I got 2 hands. So, and if you are traveling business class, how many of you are willing to pay $80 extra for the same flight? And if the company is paying, how many of you are willing to pay? There you go. As per our calculation, at 5% mandate, I mean, we have bigger experts here, but at 5%, that's all you need to pay.
I find that a low number when I read about these statistics. IATA saying getting to net zero by 2050 will require an annual investment of close to $180 billion a year. 5 trillion in capacity investment required to reach that goal, according to IATA as well. I mean, if $5 or $7 seems an extraordinarily optimistically low number.
So you have 2 parts to this story, right? The first part is 2025 to 2030, right? What do we need to do? That's basically the numbers that we're talking about, which is $5, $7, $40, which will get us to 6-7%, or pretty much across the board, everyone, the whole world saying 5% mandate, right? I think we should fix that first. Before we even start looking at 2050, this is something that we need to fix. I think where the scare is coming is that everyone, including IATA and the aviation authorities, who do not want to take up the responsibility fully on saying, this is the cost, right? But that cost is 2050 numbers, right? Let's first resolve what's there for us from 25 to 30. If we can resolve that, that in itself will make a bigger change. And then I'm sure there's technology that will evolve and the better feedstocks will come, large amount of feedstocks will come into play, and you are able to convert them at a cheaper cost, right? And it'll fix itself. Right? But you must start. Everyone, all countries must get together and say, this is it, and we are starting at whatever the point is, 1, 2, 3%.
Carlos, I was just going to ask about, you mentioned 2030, but what's beyond that? I mean, there are other ways to decarbonize the aviation industry, and there's electric planes or hydrogen potentially as technologies. But, I mean, there's certainly none of that exists at the moment. I mean, Carlos, perhaps this is a question you'd like to attempt at answering, but will we ever, see electric planes or hydrogen planes as a really viable solution to any of this in reality?
I think that, again, I'm not an expert, but our analysis says that none of those radically alternative technologies will be even available before 2035. So we are talking 2040 onwards. We really see electrification for short distance flights as something that could eventually happen, but current technology is not allowing that. Battery probably weighs more than the whole load. And hydrogen in the future, again, seems promising, but is very, very far away. We announced last year as part of our strategy an ambition to build a 2 gigawatt equivalent of hydrogen, green hydrogen production in Spain. Aviation is not within our highest merit order customers. We don't see any offtake, any interest, even in the midterm. So I really think that, as Pradeep was saying, we've got HEFA technology that is mature today, between now and mid 30s. And then there are a number of alternative technologies. Europe has announced a mandate to introduce e-fuels, a combination of biogenic CO2 and green hydrogen that hold a lot of promise. Technology is still very immature, and cost today will be many times higher than biofuels. But definitely, if there are subsidies and money coming into it and mandates, the industry will develop and the cost will come down significantly over the next decade. But we don't see that in our roadmap commercially viable before 2035. That's how we hold it. In the meantime, again, I insist, I think HEFA technology in total cost is mature and ready to go. What we need to do is start scaling this business.
And agree with what Carlos and Pradeep have mentioned. There will be different set of measures that we need to take at different points of time, right? And we'll need to work on multiple things at the same time. So HEFA, which is, stable, commercially viable to some extent, that is what needs to be scaled. Parallelly, we'll continue working on other technologies, Fisher trough, alcohol to jet, and then they will stack on top of HEFA, and then eventually there will be power to liquid. Just to give you an extent of the size of the problem, I think we must be at around, say, low single digits in terms of current capacity of SAF production in the world. They're supposed to grow multifold and get to about 15 million ton by 2030 based on projects that have been announced. What the world needs by 2050 is almost 200 to 250 million tons. So that is the gap that we are looking at. So we need to start paying the $5, and then eventually it will probably be, 100% of your flight cost. But I think first we have to just get the flywheel started. It's not an easy problem to solve, but we have to make an attempt to, solve it.
How does that sit against, though, markets where, flying is relatively new? I mean, we're seeing amazing growth coming out of places like India and China. Huge swathes of those populations have not actually taken a plane, as unbelievable as that may sound. And yet they'll be facing massively higher costs in airfares, potentially, post-2050 than we are today. So, how do we tackle that, and how can we make that fair, if that's possible?
So, like India and China, last few years have been difficult for some regions, but overall, last decade has been decent and sound growth. Many people are coming out from, the bottom of the pyramid to the middle class and, will start to travel, already traveling. I mean, for the unacquainted, if they already have to pay the green premium, and if that's the thing, they will pay it. So that's okay. And just as, rest of the world, in the last few years, domestic airfare prices have also gone up and people have paid for it. GDP per capita has also, increased in these countries. So I don't really see it as a big deterrent. I think what is really needed is, thinking about how will you support both demand and supply side. And then, the airlines and fuel producers, they will figure it out on how they want to manage the costs on their side and pass it on to the passengers there. So even India is, for example, considering 1% SAF blend mandate by 25 and perhaps taking it to 5% by 2030.
Okay, well, look, I think we are almost out of time now. So please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you.